Hello, and welcome to Permafrost, the 33rd episode in the Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, brought to you by Actuarial Risk Management. This is Dave Ingram, and I'm joined today, as always, by Max Rudolph. Today, Max will be talking about the risk from the melting of what is called permafrost. Only recently have we begun to be able to measure that melting, and we are also just starting to understand the impact that melting will have on the rest of the world. This story is chilling. But before we go on, I want to mention that nothing we say here is intended to be investment advice. We intend to provide educational material for risk managers. Today's podcast is our 8th podcast featuring an emerging risk. You can find the other 7 on our Podbeam homepage or your favorite podcast service. We hope that you will also take advantage of our free newsletter and webcast for additional education on a variety of risk and risk management topics. So let's get started.
The Earth has been relatively stable since the end of the last ice age 10,000 years ago, but small temperature changes of well under a degree have forced climate migration in the past. Global warming is increasingly complex, causing us to react to and consider the environmental ramifications. The melting of permafrost, which in some locations is 1,000 feet thick, is such an event. There's more carbon stored in permafrost than is currently found in the atmosphere, and once it starts melting, it would take less than a century to release it all. Temperature change exponentially drives decay rate. That temperatures in higher latitudes are increasing at twice the rate of the global average is not helping. Even if no additional greenhouse gases were released, warming based on imbalances currently in the ecosystem would continue. It is baked in. Some modelers hypothesize that we may hit a tipping point if temperatures increase about 3 degrees Celsius from levels in 1750, jumping quickly another 3 degrees. This has occurred in previous warming cycles, but those occurred over longer periods, except when driven by volcanic activity that quickly released greenhouse gases and increased temperatures. Permafrost may be a key component in triggering such a tipping point. Our recent historical data sets include none of these instances, so modelers need to consider deterministic narrative scenarios like the shared socioeconomic pathways developed by the IPCC to understand implications on health, finance, agriculture, geopolitics, and other systems. This would be the most challenging scenario humans ever encountered. The Arctic region sees direct warming as well as feedback loops that generate even more warming. One reason is the albedo effect. When ice covers the ocean and snow covers the landscape, much of the incoming radiation from the sun is reflected into the sky, with much of it reaching space and exiting the ecosystem. As ice and snow cover melts, it leaves open water and tundra, which both absorb more radiation, increasing the local warming. The tree line shows current limits to the growth of forests due to cold air and frozen ground. As those areas warm, the tree line is also moving to higher latitudes and altitudes. While the trees absorb carbon from the air and soil, they also absorb more radiation, so warm the area. Animals are also migrating away from the heat, with many struggling to adapt to the rate of change. Animals in the farthest north have nowhere to go, so are now competing for food with the invading groups. Keystone species and decoupling, for example, migrating insects arriving at the right time to pollinate flowers, these will lead to unexpected consequences. Much of Earth's permafrost occurs in the Arctic and in Greenland, with some also found on Antarctica. The Arctic is currently a carbon sink, taking up more carbon than it releases. As the area warms, many processes will interact and could transform the region into a carbon source, like draining peatland. When permafrost melts, microbes that were frozen become active and start to eat the now decaying matter. A methane smell appears both underground and on the surface as the gas is released. To show this effect, we see scientists poke holes in the ice covering lakes and light the methane on fire, where it's been melting below the Earth's surface and was previously constrained by the ice. Tundra returns to peat and creates depressions as the frozen ground melts, allowing lakes to drain quickly when a sinkhole forms below them. Along with carbon, other bacterial, fungal, and viral pathogens are also being released from melting permafrost. In Siberia in 2016, a frozen reindeer thawed, releasing anthrax spores and sickening many animals and killing one human. We could lack immunity or cures for other thawed pathogens, both ancient and new, or those we had previously eliminated, like bubonic plague and smallpox. We know from experience that H1N1 frozen in permafrost was recovered and its genome collected from cemeteries located in Alaska. Plants pull mercury from the atmosphere and soil. It's not a big deal when it's accumulating, with permafrost storing about twice the levels found elsewhere in soils, oceans, and the atmosphere. But when it's released, all in a short period of time, the levels of mercury can be very dangerous as it enters the food chain through fish. An even worse situation occurs when heavy rains speed up the melting process. The IPCC models become more accurate and sophisticated in each 7-year cycle. Previous iterations have not included permafrost and the ramifications that melting will have on feedback loops. A sudden release of methane from melting permafrost would accelerate any warming currently present. This could be why current models have underestimated temperature increases.
Max, how do scientists assess and predict the rate at which permafrost is melting?
Yeah, scientists have drilled ice cores in places like Greenland, Siberia, and Antarctica, so they can tell what has melted and what was in there chemically at the time. Satellites also help measure the thickness of ice sheets and sea level rise. And then this information is all combined with that collected on frozen ground around the world and the salinity in the oceans where rivers are emptying, where you have fresh water meeting salt water. And then the changes are all trended. Much of this impact is a direct result of temperature warming. As you get closer to the poles, the temperature changes are at least double what they are closer to the equator. And this creates a feedback loop as ice melts and more of the sun's radiation is absorbed by plants and dark water. This is called the albedo effect, and it describes how much of the sun's rays are reflected back into space without being absorbed.
It seems to me, Max, that temperatures have gone up and down over the past 1,000 years. Why are we so sure now that this is a permanent move to a warmer world?
Well, in his book Collapse, Jared Diamond tells the story of the Norsemen who attempted to colonize North America with an outpost in Newfoundland. And they were initially successful, but then were overwhelmed by the slow-moving little ice age that dropped temperatures by less than 4 degrees over more than 500 years. Diamond theorized that the group did not adapt to the changes, noting that the local Inuit population did not leave and was very healthy and survived. But now there's an alternative explanation that's come out that the colder temps caused the ice sheet on Greenland to thicken, and the gravity created by that it pulled the nearby water up, raising sea level and creating more flooding events. And the Norsemen were living right on the coast in areas that would have been impacted by that quite a bit. So they lost stability, even in this case where the localized impact was not always consistent with the global impact of the temperature changes. I've talked about the year without a summer in the past, in 1815 roughly, and it's a good example of all the interacting factors. A volcanic eruption caused skies to fill with sulfur, blocking the sun and cooling temperatures by about a degree. And that's key, only 1 degree. This led to famines across the northern hemisphere and a form of climate migration from Europe to New England and from New England to the Midwest. Today, we're likely to increase temperatures by more than even the little ice age amount over a period well under a century. Scientists have been able to use tree, ice, and rock cores along with other methods to determine both the levels of carbon dioxide and temperatures in the near and distant past. And it shows a direct relationship between carbon dioxide and temperatures. For every 10 parts per million, the temperature rises about a tenth of a degree Celsius. And we're seeing record highs right now, and there's some question as to what's driving that. It'll be interesting over the next year or so to see the interaction between the El Nino event that's happening and the underwater volcano that went off last year that normally would shoot sulfur into the air, but didn't because it was underwater, but did shoot water vapor into the air, and water vapor has a warming effect. So if temperatures drop again next year, it'll be likely because that was a temporary effect. And if they don't, then we have a real major issue.
Well, let's talk about this for just a second in terms of a particular place. I can picture Alaska as this great white area. How will permafrost melting change the ecosystem there?
The permafrost melts, this will release water that's been frozen. We'll see sinkholes form, sometimes draining lakes, and precipitation will increase at the same time. Rivers will carry more fresh water to the oceans, turning lagoons less salty, and benefiting some plants and animals while hurting others, changing the ecosystem in ways that often provide advantages to invasive species. Rivers will move faster, carrying more sediment from the weathering of rocks, and areas will dry out. There's lots of changes that I'm describing here, and it'll challenge anyone living in the area to adapt. Archaeologists have been excavating artifacts from the permafrost in near perfect conditions lately, helping us to understand the migration from Asia to the American continent. But these areas are really negatively impacted as the ground melts and decay resumes. So that clock is ticking for the archaeologists.
Max, we're nearing the release of millions of cicadas in the eastern United States. Darwin's theory of evolution relies on random selection. Does a warming world put this mechanism at risk of not working as expected?
Yeah, global warming is happening very quickly. Evolution works much better if change occurs over time periods of centuries and millennium and longer than that. We could see major issues if decoupling causes pollinators to show up at the wrong time. Birds are migrating toward the poles earlier, and lots needs to go right at each of their food stops to be a success. We see, even the cherry trees are blooming about 3 weeks earlier than they were when I was in college and went to see them. In the ocean, penguins rely on a specific place at the boundary waters called the polar front, where the Southern Ocean meets the Atlantic and Pacific, with nutrient-rich cold water meeting warmer and salty water, where they spend 5 to 6 days after traveling 250 miles from their spouse and their egg. It's got to be in the same place as the last trip. It can't be moving around. So these changes are happening so fast that many species cannot adapt quickly enough to survive. It's really going to be a problem. It already is a problem, but it's going to be even more so.
Wow, what a story. Permafrost isn't permanent. It's actually melting. It is getting warmer faster at the poles, and as the permafrost melts, warming increases. And to top it all off, melting permafrost releases carbon dioxide and methane. And don't forget about the mercury, the potential release of ancient diseases. Plants and animals will have to be moving around and competing for food in places that for a long time were fairly stable ecosystems. Buildings and roads in the areas of former permafrost may become unstable, which will have a major impact on groups living in or near those areas. Seems like we have identified another canary in the coal mine relating to climate change. On those cheery notes, we end today's podcast. Remember that today's podcast is our 8th Emerging Risk podcast. We hope that you have learned something from this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If so, please like, subscribe, and share the link with your coworkers. Thanks. Talk to you next time when we continue our story of regime change. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Now we want to tell you about ARM's ERM Advisory Services. Our ERM Advisory team, led by Dave Ingram and Max Rudolph, is available to provide a wide range of support to your enterprise risk management program. For example, we provide ERM training and education for insurer boards, executives, risk management staff, and general employees. The Crossing Thin Ice series of newsletters, webcasts, and podcasts, which you just listened to, are examples. A full range of ERM topics are available for presentation in person, live via webcast, or delivered as a recording for general ERM education or advanced training. And we can adapt our material to align with your existing or planned ERM approach. You can even mix and match, reserving us for a day or more with time split between education and risk discussions. We are happy to discuss your situation and how we might provide you with the help that you need to move forward, drawn from our decades of experience working with insurer ERM programs.